All right.
Okay, do you see it?
On my face. I'm not sure what direction. A snack tray. So it's kind of crazy. Okay, this is better. It's more light.
Okay.
All right, good.
All right, so do you see the notification?
I do. Yes, Youri's recording the call. Yes.
Okay, perfect. All righty. Well, everybody, welcome to 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. I am so excited for the guest that we have on, because it is Margaret Kimberley, and anyone who has watched my previous videos on YouTube or in SoundCloud knows that I have mentioned an outlet called Black Agenda Report many times. Margaret Kimberley is the senior columnist for Black Agenda Report, which is a fantastic independent news outlet, and it's news commentary and analysis from a black left perspective. They do fantastic media criticisms, but they also do NGO criticisms, and they're not afraid to even attack much of the left when they jump the shark on imperialism and so forth. So, Miss Kimberley, thank you so much for being being my guest, fifth episode. And all right, so let's get to it. Now, Miss Kimberley, so last February was Black History Month.
Yes.
And you've and which is why and although we're a bit late, but you do have a new book out which is very relevant.
Yes.
And that book is that book is prejudicial, right?
Prejudicial. It's a word we invented with the publisher. I'm going to be shameless and just put it up to my head.
No, go ahead. Go right ahead.
Presidential Black America and the Presidents, which was published this February by Steerforth Press. And thank you for inviting me to come talk about it.
My pleasure. And so and let's talk about the book because I think just like Michelle Alexander's book, the new Jim Crow, which I think was quite a tour de force, because it was not only talking about the issues our people are facing at the moment, but she did go into the history. How did we arrive at this stage of mass incarceration? And she wasn't afraid to take on the taboo subject, which is the drug war. So your new book, which is a history book about each U.S. president,
right.
And the thesis of the book is basically how each U.S. president has been, has been ghastly towards Black people, right?
Yes. If you start with the first president, with George Washington, and go all the way up to Donald Trump, as I did, 45 chapters. It is clear that anti-Black racism is foundational to the United States, starting out as a settler colonial state, beginning obviously with the genocide of indigenous people, and then continuing with the growth of the plantation economy and chattel slavery. And of course, the legacy of these acts, these genocides, is a country that is deeply racist. And so we see the presidency being a very racist office. It does, after all, represent the system. And people reach that office because in various ways, to various degrees, they uphold the system. It's not a job where anybody goes to break the mold. Within limits, sometimes it can happen, but Democrats, Republicans, the Democratic Party, by the way, was the party of the segregated South until the late 60s, and the Republicans were the party of Lincoln, who was.
It was the original. It was as you and your colleagues would say, the Democrats were the original white man's party.
Yes, they were. They were the white people's party. Now the Republicans are, but. Whatever the era, whichever president, whichever party, the effort to deny Black people their human rights is a common feature, decade in and decade out. And we see that we make the greatest strides when we make demands and act together in mass. So that is true in during the Civil War. I think I make it clear in the book that Abraham Lincoln was not the great emancipator. He would say things like, if slavery isn't wrong, nothing is wrong. But in fact, he did not want to make the war a war against slavery. It was the enslaved themselves who would escape to Union lines, who forced the issue. And even towards the end of his life, shortly before he was assassinated, he made it clear he never gave up hope of sending Black people out of the country and having an all-white America. He was willing to compensate the South to hundreds of millions of dollars and give them an additional 30 years to end slavery. So these are the facts of life in this country, of our political system.
But if sorry to interrupt, because I find that fascinating, and I've learned about American history on and off, having lived in California, and then very briefly when I was in middle school in Brussels, because I'm based in Belgium, and I'm amazed that the racist skeletons of Lincoln's in Lincoln's closet are not that dirty air that dirty laundry is not aired.
Well, it's covered up intentionally. One of the things I discovered researching this book is the degree to which historians lie on behalf of these people. Most historians, I believe, are people who want to affirm the system. And so they write about their subject matter and leave out anything that's inconvenient. So Lincoln is one of the most, if not the most, subjects of biography in American history. But very few of his biographers write about what I just talked about, which is obvious, which information that's easy to find. None of this information was hard to find, and it just made it clear to me how invested most historians are in upholding the image of America as this beneficent place with a proud history. Because if you look just not even that hard, you will see the things that I write about, and it's clear that others, most historians, have just decided to ignore it.
Wow. And before, yeah, actually. No, actually, yeah, we can get into Lincoln. Let's talk more about Lincoln, because your book also exposes presidents that have gotten presidents that are considered liberal icons or progressive icons. So let's talk a bit more about Lincoln, because because continuing on with with what you're saying. I mean, have been trying. I've been getting more and more into indigenous history and the plight of indigenous people, and apart from Lincoln has his reputation, as does Mark Twain, as being anti-imperialist, and as being these kind of progressive icons. When Twain, just like those Western films, they denigrate Native Americans and depict them as savages. Lincoln, during the American Civil War, I mean, if he had this reputation of being for freeing Black people, he certainly wanted to keep Native Americans under subjugated. But yeah, so can you talk about how Lincoln, talk a bit more about Lincoln. I mean, because he has this reputation of being an abolitionist, and of course there's Steven Spielberg's films that depict him as a friend of the Negroes.
Yeah, well, he never gave up his dream of making America an all-white country. So as a young man, he fought in the Sac and Fox Wars against those indigenous groups. He said he hated slavery. The Republican Party, which was a new party at the time, was dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery. Some Republicans were abolitionists, but most were not. They just wanted to contain slavery where it was and keep it away from them. Some of that sentiment was just an effort to keep Black people away from white people. Lincoln wanted Black people out of the country. He said so. He said it directly to Black people. He set up an office of colonization. There was a brief colony off the coast of Haiti. 400 people were sent there. It didn't last long. They weren't provisioned very well. There was illness and death, and the survivors were brought home. But he always linked colonization to emancipation. His staff, his cabinet officers said so. He established this office, which said so. He said so up until shortly before his assassination. So this information is very clear, and it's not something that anyone can dispute. Any honest person can dispute. So, this man who, yes, and he was the wartime president. His presidency lasted during the Civil War. He died he was the first president to be assassinated. Yes, he was not formally educated, and yet he wrote great words, and all those things are true. But where Black people were concerned, he was not much better than anybody else. In fact, he was worse because his goal was not to bring justice to Black people, but to say that we should get out of the country. And this is something, it's very important for people to say this. There's a great book. It's a big book, unlike mine, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream by Lerone Bennett. So anybody who wants to know more about it ought to read that book. It's one of my sources for that chapter.
Now, Australia, when it was kind of a self-governing colony of Britain, and kinds of sort of like the U.S. became independent from Britain, Canada became independent from Britain, Australia at one point became independent from Britain, but then very quickly, when Australia was founded as it's sort of as sort of its own country, they had what they called the White Australia policy. So nobody could. So Australia was basically founded as a white country, and also very much a nativist country. So no immigration. At some point, they did allow immigrants in the country, except they had to have they had to be white. Is it safe? And of course, Aboriginal people were subjugated. Is it safe to say that Lincoln kind of had that vision for the U.S. Had he not been murdered? He would have tried to pursue something like that? Absolutely.
And I think Reconstruction, which was the period after the Civil War, when there was this brief, all too brief moment when Black people obtained some political and human rights, I think if Lincoln had lived, even that would not have happened. Australia, by the way, and Canada are still members of the Commonwealth. And so I believe they still have the Queen.
And New Zealand, too, and New Zealand as well.
Their head of state. But Australia now is a multi-ethnic country. There are Asian people there. I know there's some Africans in Australia now, but the Aboriginal people, the indigenous people, just like in this country and in Canada, were victims of genocide. The island of Tasmania, they killed every single human being there. So this is something that the settler colonial state was not unique to the United States. There are other examples, and the results were as deadly in other parts of the world. But you're right, this desire to conquer other places and replace people is the settler colonial state. And the U.S. is an example of that. But that's why racism, especially anti-Black racism, persists so much. And that's why people cover it up. They don't want to talk about, if you talk about the past, you end up talking about the present, because you can't have that history and then expect to see Black people be able to accomplish the same things, to have the same rights, to have the same opportunities. And once you get that information, then you have to do something with it. I mean, you can live in cognitive dissonance, or you can just say, well, I'd rather believe Lincoln was the good guy. And that, unfortunately, is where most people end up. They end up affirming the system instead of being more interested in the truth.
And yeah, and something I want to add to that before we talk about the next president is that I think Lenny Bruce once said that if white America told the truth for one day, its whole world would fall apart.
I didn't know he said that, but that is why the truth is not told. It's and especially when people have privilege to some degree, just being white gives one privilege. And to turn that down, to say, I don't want that, to say, I want a fair society, that is something very difficult for most people to do. And so they don't do it. And that's why I needed to write this book.
Well, let's talk about the other president, which has a good reputation, Teddy Roosevelt, who led the U.S. out of the Gilded Age. The UK had its Dickensian period, its brutal Victorian period. America had the Gilded Age. Teddy Roosevelt led us out of there into the progressive era. But dear Lord, was he? But that was progressive. But that was progressivism only for white people, right?
Absolutely, he was an arch imperialist. Built this Panama Canal, but that was built by enticing the Panama region, to secede from Colombia. So basically, the country that's now Panama was stolen from Colombia. As far as Black people go, yes, he was a Republican, and at that time, the Republicans were the Black People's Party. But he did one of the most shameful things he did in 1906. A group of Black soldiers were stationed in Brownsville, Texas, and they were under constant harassment from the local white population. They were blamed for a murder that they did not commit. And Roosevelt waited until after Election Day, after those Black people in the North who could vote, waited for after their voting, and a couple of days later, court-martialed all of those men in that unit. That's the sort of thing he did. He was an open white supremacist. He talked about his white navy, his sending his white navy all over the world. He openly said that white people were superior to Black people. He said that lynchings were caused by Black men raping white women. There is a strange story about him. He, as racist as he was, Ivy League educated, old money, noblesse oblige kind of guy. And he did invite Booker T. Washington for dinner, and there was this firestorm of protest from Southern segregationists that he invited a Black man to dinner. So they backtracked and they said, well, he wasn't there. Well, it was just lunch. Well, no, Mrs. Roosevelt didn't join the dinner. I mean, they did everything to try to get out of this controversy. And shortly thereafter, he announced that the president's residence would be called the White House, and that it would be the official name. And there are many people who believed that was a reaction to the racist invective after he invited Booker T. Washington.
Can you, in your book, do you talk? In your book, did you explore by any chance the fact that that Teddy Roosevelt harbored eugenicist views, which was this disgusting racial scientist, white supremacist, theory that Native Americans, the reason why they're in these reserves, they were born, well,
subhuman. I only touched on it.
And Black people also subhuman, and like poor white folks are, degenerates that should be, sterilized and all that and all of that.
Yeah, he did. He said white women were obligated to have lots of babies to make sure that white people remained in the majority. Constantly made racist statements. So yes, he was a eugenicist. I only touched on that briefly, but that is absolutely true. Actually, this book project started. I wrote a column in Black Agenda Report about Roosevelt after watching a documentary on American television, which was a cover-up of these things that we're talking about. And a friend and supporter of Black Agenda Report suggested that I write about all the presidents. So I don't know, in a strange way, I've got to thank Teddy Roosevelt. But anyway, but that's the truth of the man. And it's that kind of thing that, the racist appeal is not new with Donald Trump. He's not the first. He's just the last in a long line of presidents who used anti-Black racism as a means of getting political support. It's an integral part of American history.
And but before going on to the next president, but what were some of the specific racist laws which really impacted Black people that Teddy Roosevelt was an advocate of? Like, did he do like forced sterilizations on poor Black women and have them like kind of like racked and stacked in like mental institutions and so forth?
Well, he did not personally do that sort of thing. That sort of thing happened all the time. But what had happened by the time he became president when McKinley was assassinated. In the 1890s, there was a groundbreaking Supreme Court case, not in a good way, Plessy versus Ferguson, which the Supreme Court decided that segregation was legal as long as accommodations. It was about public accommodation. Accommodations
as long as it was fair and equal.
Right, you're right. Separate but equal, which obviously is a lie. By being separate, it's not going to be equal. But there were people who hoped that Congress would overturn that decision, and waited in vain. And that was something that as soon as slavery ended and some Black people had the vote, we saw this pattern that continues to this day, where it is hoped that the party most friendly to Black people will take some action on our behalf. So there was a Civil Rights Act after Reconstruction. The Supreme Court overturned that law, and Republican president after president, Black people would support them in hopes that they would do something about it, and they never did. Roosevelt never did anything about Plessy versus Ferguson. He never did anything about lynch law. Republicans, Democrats, none of them ever raised a finger to make these very what should have been elemental decisions to protect human rights. And that did not happen again until in earnest until the 1960s, but it's Black people who made it happen with a mass movement which pressured the political system into giving some of what they were looking for.
Before we talk about FDR, because because he mentioned that that due to the resilience and the strength of Black people, Black-led civil rights movement, they were the ones that really deserve all of the credit for the gains made. So sometimes when you see these movies, and some of them are very good. I will give credit to some of the movies that are made in Hollywood when they talk about certain things that happened in history, like 12 Years a Slave and so forth, or films like The Help. But they still sort of depict that if not for white people, justice would have never been advanced. So, but what's your view on that? Is that Hollywood liberal BS or?
Well, it's an effort to, like the historians, it's an effort to make white people feel comfortable. So that's why I don't go to movies. One of the many reasons I don't go to movies anymore. So they always have a white savior who, is presented as the one who made the great stride, when it's always Black people who stepped up and risked a lot, including their lives, sometimes lost their lives, to bring about these needed changes. Roosevelt, at the time, the Democrats were the party of the segregated South, and his
We're
excuse was always,
talking about FDR,
I'm
Franklin.
sorry, yes, Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And they were related, by the way, as
Yep,
people.
yeah,
I don't know if people know that Eleanor Roosevelt was Theodore Roosevelt's niece, and she and Franklin were very distant cousins. But at any rate,
oh wow.
Yes, true. So Black people hoped, and in general, they supported his New Deal programs, which often were subverted, whereby the Southern segregationists, he would, they would ask him about anti-lynching legislation. He would say he couldn't do it. There was discrimination in the workplace in the defense industries around the time of the war. And he finally did bring about some legislation and a civil rights commission of a sort. But that's because A. Philip Randolph, a Union leader, threatened to march on Washington. So again and again, we see it's Black people making the demand, taking the action, which leads to change. So I think these presidents, even when they do the right thing, they don't deserve a lot of the credit. It's the people who deserve the credit.
And FDR, is it safe to say that? Is it safe to say that FDR, just like Teddy Roosevelt, just like Abraham Lincoln, Teddy, he was a progressive, except only for white people. FDR, is it safe to say that he was a New Dealer, but only for white people?
Yeah, the New Deal programs were, for example, the Social Security Act, which was quite a revolutionary thing. FDR is the one who made the federal government an activist agency on behalf of people. He did do that. But originally, the Social Security benefits were excluded farm work and domestic work. Well, what work did most Black people do? Most of whom at that time still lived in the South. What did most of them do? Farm work and domestic work. So there had to be amendments in the 50s to make sure that Black.
Wait. So Social Security,
yes,
excluded people who worked in the farming and
agricultural workers and domestic people, mostly women who worked as servants.
How many people even know that, though?
Not many. There's a great book called When Affirmative Action. It's called When Affirmative Action Was White, and I do recommend that. And it's Black people, the work most of us did was originally not eligible for Social Security benefits. The GI Bill, everybody loves to talk about the GI Bill after the Second World War, which helped veterans buy homes and go to school and all sorts of things. Black veterans were often excluded because it was administered by the states. And what does that mean for us? Well, we already know that story. So When Affirmative Action Was White is a great resource for anybody who wants to know more about that.
Wow, that is that is shocking. That is wow. I think it's also important to to add for people who keep painting FDR as the great liberal, progressive, some would even say socialist hero, was that he himself also did harbor eugenicist views, and of course World War II that everyone depicts as the good war, as Howard Zinn like to brutally remind people, was of course the Japanese internment camps.
Oh, absolutely! It's one of the
Japanese American internment camps.
Yes. And once the war began, Japanese, many of whom were American citizens, were interned. Most of whom lived on the West Coast in the Pacific. Were taken to internment camps for the duration of the war. There was a Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court, to its eternal shame, Korematsu was the case, ruled against Korematsu, who brought his lawsuit. And so it was perfectly legal for these people to have been detained so unjustly. And that was something that FDR did. So when people talk about how wonderful it, and I think it's very important to demystify these people. Otherwise, we end up giving them cover and being an acceptance of things that were really horrible. And a lot of historians, they get out of that dilemma by just not mentioning this stuff. They just leave it out, and so they get to feel good, and the readers get to feel good. But the truth is trampled on, and then we can't talk about anything honestly if you're told that people, by virtue of having been president, are somehow superior and never did anything wrong, or explaining away by saying, well, it was a product of his time. Everybody owned slaves in whatever era. But there were always people who said that wrong. That is not true. It's just an excuse. But these are it's important for us to be truthful, and it's important for people to hear the truth. It's a funny thing about propaganda. A lot of propaganda is just repetition. You just hear something over and over again, and you don't hear anything else. And you break through by saying something else, by questioning whether we should have monuments to these people, by pointing out that 10 of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders, while by talking about how presidents used racist appeals to win office. Even Barack Obama, the scolding of Black people, the criticism of Black people, that was talking, in effect, over our heads straight to white people and making them feel comfortable about voting for a Black man for this office. So that's why if I may say so myself, that's why this book is so important, and other books too. I hope people, first of all, buy the book, and that they check out some of the other source material, because there's a lot out there. There's so much history for people who are interested to find out.
Before we talk about JFK and RFK, the Kennedy brothers, talk briefly about how Eleanor Roosevelt was also very insincere in her very insincere in her solidarity for Black folk and Black women.
Yeah, she was seen as being the more liberal of the two. And so she had friendships with Black people at the time. That was unusual for that to be public. And Mary McLeod Bethune, a Black woman, a founder of Bethune-Cookman College, became a confidant of hers. And this was a big deal at the time. And people of my late parents' generation loved it and loved the Roosevelts because of it. But she also did at the same time keep Black people in their place. So, for example, she had a column, and one of them was called "If I Were a Negro," and basically she said, if I were a Black person, I wouldn't ask for too much, I wouldn't demand too much, I wouldn't move too fast. So she was the big liberal, but that's what she said. And so that was Eleanor. But I hope that people also get used to hearing this information, so that we don't think of any individual as being so superior, and that we get used to looking for other heroes. I know most people want to defend their group, want to be positive about their country. Well, the people to be positive about are not presidents. So if there's a white man in the 1800s you want to admire, it should be John Brown, the man who planned to save slave insurrection and lit the spark that started the Civil War. If you want to admire him, if there's a politician, it's probably generally not a politician, but it's the people who stepped up to the politicians. It's Mary McLeod Bethune. I'm sorry, not Mary McLeod Bethune. I'm so sorry, Fannie Lou Hamer, who deserves credit for fighting for the human rights of Black people. And Lyndon Johnson was forced by people like her, so much so that he had to cut her off on television when at the Democratic Convention in 1964, she talked about being beaten savagely in Mississippi. These are the people we need to admire, the people who resisted. And these people who were in resistance ought to be our heroes. We can still have heroes, but they just can't be the people we've been told should be the heroes.
that's a perfect segue to JFK and RFK. So please, do some much needed myth busting on the Kennedy brothers, and take all the time you want on that, because my mother is a big fan of the Kennedys, and in recent years I've grown to become much more critical of the Kennedys. I do believe in the conspiracy theory that the deep state murdered both of them, but that's another subject for
Another story.
But
Well, JFK, as I said, late 50s, he ran for president in 1960. The Democrats were the party of the South, so you balanced the ticket by a Northerner with the Southerner, so he picked the segregationist Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. He very shrewdly, in several weeks before Election Day, Martin Luther King had been arrested, and he made this phone call to Coretta King, and just said he was thinking of her. He was going to try to help her husband. I don't know what he actually said, but the fact that he reached out at all got him a few extra votes, and he won a very close election. But he was beholden to the Southerners, and he was another one who used that excuse. He and his brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, were not supportive of the Freedom Riders. They would not give them protection they asked for. They allowed J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI to conduct surveillance of Martin Luther King, to tap his phone. Bobby Kennedy, in particular, he hated the March on Washington. John Kennedy's first meeting with Martin Luther King was held in secret. It wasn't public. They, didn't tell the press, because that's how controversial it was for him to meet King. So that's but again, it's the movement that did not stop, that got us the legislation, which now everybody brags about, but it's the people who did it, and it's none of these politicians. And I think we have to see ourselves in opposition to politicians. We have to see ourselves as having an adversarial relationship with them. Because if we don't make demands, they take the path of least resistance, and all the pressure is on them to maintain the status quo. So if we have a hope of having our concerns addressed, we must be active.
What do you say to Kennedy apologists on the on the soft centrist liberal left, and even those who call themselves socialists? What do you say to them when they say, well, the reason why Kennedy allowed Martin Luther King Jr. and other Black justice leaders to be surveilled by J. Edgar Hoover was because J. Edgar Hoover got dirt on Kennedy's sexual escapades, and so Kennedy and so RFK had to do. He had to placate the deep state in order. What do you say to that?
Well, but tell the whole truth. Talk about how this man Hoover, how horrible he was. Who, by the way, it is said was a person of Black ancestry, who hid that, who passed for white. Yes, he was a gay man who was closeted and passed for straight, and he was a Black man passing for white. His birth certificate, he was born in Washington, D.C. His birth certificate mysteriously disappeared. That's because in those days, birth certificates had listed race of the baby. But he
wow. Wait. Time out for a second. Yes. J. Edgar Hoover was a Black descent, like not even a Black man, but a Black descent.
Yes, he was.
Wow, that's I think that's our first scoop on 1+1.
Sure, it's like something that's not talked about very often, but there are Black people who knew they were related to him, but they knew not to say anything, and children were sworn to secrecy, not to talk about the fact that they were related to J. Edgar Hoover. His family was originally from Mississippi. A common story where they were descended from the slave master, very light-skinned people, and many of them were able to pass for white, and he was among them. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. But I think it's important to say, not to excuse Kennedy, but to talk about how corrupt the system was. That this man was head of the FBI for 40, nobody should have a job for 40 years, but he had dirt on everybody. And that's how because he was closeted, because he was passing. So he made it difficult so he, in effect, told presidents what they were and weren't going to do. But that means you have to say the Kennedys went along. They went along to, what's the expression? You go along to get along. And that's what they did. So they were no better than anybody else. And they actually had the power to do something about him, but they just went along with inertia and allowed this man to tell them what to do, which tells me they didn't really oppose it that much. Not really.
What wasn't the Kennedys' father an anti-communist fundamentalist as well?
Oh, he was horrible. He was a very racist man. He was made his fortune selling whiskey in the days of.
Yeah, he was a bootlegger.
Yes, bootlegger. Thank you so much. And very conservative Democrat, very reactionary man. FDR appointed him to be ambassador to the UK to get him out of the country because he made noises about running for president himself and opposing FDR. So that's the background they came from. But they were, among the elite, the Ivy League education and so forth. So they got good people to cover for them, to write great speeches, and that's pretty much all it amounts to, as far as I am concerned.
Many people probably will be shocked to know this, but wasn't RFK also part of the McCarthy witch hunts?
He certainly was in his 50s. That's how he got started politically. He was counsel to McCarthy,
which must have been a huge blow to the Black Justice movement since the American Communist Party was very much in favor of desegregation and uplifting Black people, right?
Right. Well, these were the people who ruined Paul Robeson's career, who took his passport, who conducted surveillance against Black people. So, yes, absolutely. But it's, people know this. It's not something that's unknown, but it's not talked about too much because then you have the problem of cognitive dissonance, and you're told the Kennedys were good people and wonderful. And there used to be, when I was growing up, so many Black households had this picture of King and the Kennedys, the martyred people, because they were all assassinated. But that's all they had in common. And liberals loved them, but so much of it's a fraud. And we can get rid of the fraud. We don't have to keep repeating it decade after decade.
And I don't want to talk too much about LBJ, but it is important to mention that that Kennedy, who who a lot of people say was the true civil rights leader. Well, all of those progressive laws, anti-racist laws, only passed under LBJ, but that was LBJ kind of riding the the popularity of JFK. But as you mentioned, LBJ actually wasn't a huge fan of the civil rights movement and hated Martin Luther King Jr. and his protests, and then especially hated him when he became part of the anti-war movement, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll answer the last part of your question first. Martin Luther King, a year to the day before he was assassinated, publicly came out in opposition of the war in Vietnam. It's a very courageous stand. He paid a price for it, though, and liberals hated him for it. If you look at what the New York Times or Washington Post said about it, they vilified him. Some of his own people criticized him. They said, Johnson had done a lot and they shouldn't make him angry. But that was a very courageous stance. So Johnson's heart, I don't believe his heart was in it. He was handed this situation by fate made him president at this moment. And because of the determination of millions of ordinary people, he was forced to respond and do the right thing. But he was forced into it, and it was the people's victory, not his.
Now, did the FBI's war on the Black Panther Party, the the anti-war movements, and all the other people power movements like the Young Lords, the American Indian movement, did that start under LBJ, or was that really Nixon's full frontal
No,
war?
but by the time Nixon became president, COINTELPRO was discovered in the counterintelligence program in the early 70s. The FBI had people on the left under surveillance for decades, the Communist Party, but COINTELPRO really ramped up with the liberation movement, the determination to get rid of the Black Panther Party. They were involved in very directly the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago in 1969. Having people under surveillance, having agent provocateurs, turning people into spies. All of these things happened. And we discovered it because a group of people broke into an FBI office near Philadelphia in 1971. And the Washington Post courageously printed the material, and that is how we discovered the full extent of FBI law breaking against American citizens.
And I'm curious before we talk about Clinton and Obama. Now, and I'm just curious because something needs to be myth busted about the Black Panther Party and also Malcolm X. Now, I as a black person got my hands on any book about the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. when I was growing up in California, and then became a history buff moving to Belgium. But every time my mainly white peers. My mainly white peers and white teachers, every time they would talk about, Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party, it was always like, well, the NAACP, they were the good ones fighting the good fight for your people. Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, they were the bad apples, and they would have stitched you guys back. But in the end of the day, the Black Panthers, I mean, yeah, they talked. I mean, their rhetoric, you could say, was very okay, but they never. And yes, they carried around with guns, but they never murdered.
No, they didn't. I think the full name is the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And they argued that they had a right under American law to defend themselves from attack by the police. But it's the radicals who get things done. And that's why they were crushed, because they were so popular. So many people of a certain age, people in their, I guess now their early 70s, so many of them were Panthers. It was extremely popular, and that's why they had to be crushed, because they were revolutionaries, they were socialists, and they wanted to liberate Black people, and that's why they got rid of them.
And the horror, and I'm sure the horror stories that were probably printed about the Panthers at the times, at the time from your New York Times or LA Times and the Washington Post, was that basically just psyops? Was that basically just like fake news just to discredit the Black Panthers? Because as far as I'm concerned, the Black Panthers actually never advocated killing white people. They didn't want to separate from the country. They wanted racial justice. They wanted social justice. But hey, if anybody was killed, police or officers, that was only because the Black Panthers were defending themselves, right?
Oh, yes, that's absolutely true. But there's a boundary that you're not supposed to cross. So at first, when King gets started, he's vilified. Who is this guy asking for rights? He's going too far. He's going too fast. Then you don't go away, and then they, accept you. But then there's another step in the process. And then as he became more radical, then he was vilified. But it's the radicals, the moderates don't get anything done. It's the people who push the envelope, the people who are not liked by the power structure are always the ones who get things done. And you have, as Malcolm X said himself, if you look at who the white power structure tells you to admire, you're looking more than likely at someone who is not doing anything for you. That was true 50 years ago, and it's true now.
Talk to us about the Clintons and how the Clintons were probably they were probably the most racist towards our people.
Sure. Bill Clinton was a Democrat, and by that time, black people were married to the Democratic Party, but he was very conservative. When he was campaigning for president in 1992, he went home to Arkansas and executed a mentally disabled black man who was in no mental condition to assist in his own defense, as the law requires in the U.S. As president, he got rid of one of the best things FDR did. We talked about the Social Security Act, and people had the right to public assistance. Clinton got rid of that, and he plunged millions of people into poverty. He's the one who started with the crack cocaine laws that put so many black people behind bars. The deregulated Wall Street, which led to the horrible crash in 2008, which we're still living with. There was consolidation of the media. There used to be rules about media consolidation. You couldn't own a TV station and a newspaper in the same city, for example. Well, he got rid of that, and the end result now is that there are 6 corporations that control everything we see and hear in the United States. The Sister Souljah moment, so-called, when he used the words of a rapper to embarrass Jesse Jackson.
Yeah, actually, before you talk about the Sister Souljah moment, because I think it's important also for a bit of historical context. Now, Jesse Jackson, who was part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization. Talk briefly about Jesse Jackson, his 2 runs for the Democratic Party, and how Bill Clinton basically was saying to him and his Rainbow Coalition, why don't you stop talking about racial politics and get behind me? And he did a lot of finger wagging at Jesse, didn't he?
Oh, he did. We have Jesse Jackson ran for president in 84 and 88. Both times, I think it was these were voter outreach efforts, voter registration efforts, and they were efforts to keep the Democratic Party from ignoring black people and ignoring the left and progressives in general. Obviously, he didn't get the nomination either time, but they were seen as efforts that would benefit black people and silence that part of the Democratic Party, which sided sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly with racists in order to get the votes of white racists. So Bill Clinton, in that moment, made it clear to white people that he was putting black people back in their place. And with all of that, he also, during his campaign, had a photo opportunity outside of a prison in Georgia. And black men in prison uniforms, they were paraded around for the cameras while he talked about how tough he was on crime. But he was a Democrat. He was not the Republican. So he was the person we were to loyally follow. And at the time, I was less astute than I am now, and I'm embarrassed to say I voted for him, but I don't vote for Democrats anymore.
Don't worry, Miss Kimberley. I mean, I used to also fall for the Clinton mythology he was a good left winger, but he was forced to go to the right because of a Republican majority, and because and that look, with the Monica Lewinsky thing was nonsense, and of course that's completely, made people, ignore the real fires that are involved with Clinton in terms of some of his abuses towards women and so forth like that. But Clinton, talk about the Sister Souljah moment, and how the Black Misleadership class, in the end of the day, finished the job in having Clinton's reign of terror unleashed on black folk and everyone and everyone.
Yes, he in 1992, that was the year of, there were riots in Los Angeles, California,
Yeah.
when the police who beat Rodney King were acquitted. And Sister Souljah, who was a rap artist, she said somewhat satirically, she said, well, you know, why is it okay for Black people to kill Black people? Why is everybody upset about Black people killing white people? And she was making a political point, but Bill Clinton quoted her in order to silence Jesse Jackson and silence any independent Black opinion. It was regarded as a key moment in his campaign in 1992. Jesse Jackson did not complain, to his detriment. I think he was, in the moment, he was just shocked by it. But that's the kind of thing Bill Clinton did. There was a nomination. He nominated a woman, Lani Guinier, a law professor, to be the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and she was smeared by the right wing, and he ditched her nomination and didn't defend her or allow her to defend himself. So that's the kind of person he is, known by the moniker Slick Willie. And that's
Yes,
who he
yes,
that's
yes,
who he
yes,
was.
yeah.
And that's who his wife was. And she was even a worse politician than he was. And it's her fault that Trump won, just to make a long story short. So.
And so now, how is it? I just remember what I wanted to ask. To talk about how the Black Misleadership class played a pivotal role, though, in hoodwinking people that Slick Willie was going to be a friend of Black people.
Well, this group that we at Black Agenda Report refer to as the Black Misleadership class, politicians, heads of the civil rights organizations, they they're the people who allegedly represent us, but they really represent the needs of the system, and they give them cover. So Congressman John Lewis said, well, you know, let's not worry about what Jesse Jackson said. We need him in the White House. And that's what most Black politicians said and did. But that's the role they always play in doing the bidding of the Democratic Party establishment and not doing the bidding of the people who they are supposedly representing. So that's quite common. That was true in 1992, and it's true today.
And is the Black Misleadership class too? Are they certainly in the 90s? They're to the right of Black people. So Black people, Glenn Ford has often, your colleague Glenn Ford has often said that, you know, that Black people are the most left-leaning constituency in the U.S. on economic policies, on social policies. So it's the Black Misleadership class and many leaders of Black churches to the right then of Black people, like supporting the Get Tough on, supporting.
Well, they are interested in their position. They get elective office positions, media attention, money by representing the needs of the system. And Black people, unfortunately, because we think we can't be independent and we think our only solution is to follow Democrats, we vote against our interest and vote against the people who are talking about what we want. If we are convinced that someone can't win, if we are convinced that Clinton, for example, Bill Clinton is going to win, the Republican will be gone, we'll have a Democrat in. So don't pay attention to the Sister Souljah moment or the execution or any of the other things that people should have paid attention to. This is the only way for us. And now Black politics has been shrunken down to just keeping Republicans out of office. So you can justify just about anyone or anything if you make the case that a certain person or following a certain party is going to help a Democrat over Republicans. And that is the sad story of where we are now. It's a politics driven by fear. Black leadership, along with the rest of the Democratic Party, coalesced around Joe Biden, who's going to, I'm quite convinced, will lose to Trump.
Definitely. Yeah. I completely agree with that. And now, and yeah, one final thing about Clint before we get into before we get into Obama was now Clint. Is it safe to say that Clinton was even more vicious in the racist drug war?
Yes, he was. He put thousands of black people in jail. The crack cocaine laws were responsible for a huge increase in mass incarceration. Absolutely, he did a great deal of damage to black people.
And I like to call Clinton's policies and Tony Blair's policies neo-Dickensian, because the way they treated the poor, you would think that you're reading something of Charles Dickens.
Yeah. With neoliberalism, it's all about giving to the rich. It's the reverse Robin Hood. It's giving to the rich and taking from the poor. And in both countries now, you see how the effects of austerity that have been, and I'm being quite literal, have been deadly in both places. If you could look at the COVID-19 epidemic, both countries have been hit particularly hard. The U.S. doesn't even pretend to have a real public health care system. And England, decades of austerity now have destroyed their national health service. So
yeah,
yes, absolutely.
And the NHS is nothing but a logo. It's not. It's like it's not really an NHS. It's not that single payer system that came out because Thatcher, and Blair underfunded it and then privatized it, and then finally with the rise of the Cameron Clegg coalition, it effectively was ended the NHS as we know it.
Yeah.
And now let's talk about Obama and the real Obama legacy, which I think many people who probably who will read your book will go, well, we can understand that this legacy of white supremacy, but ironically Obama continued that white supremacist legacy, right?
Sure, that's what presidents do. That's how you get elected. So he made the racist appeals with his constant scolding and criticism of black people, the jokes about cousin Pookie and Ray Ray.
Talk about that. Talk about that.
Well, when he talked about the importance of voting, he made up this character Pookie. Tell cousin Pookie to get off the couch. And it was one of his signature lines to get a laugh when he spoke in public. Pookie didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, though. So anyway, that's another story. But whenever he was asked about helping black people in particular, he always said, no, the rising tide lifts all boats, and I'm not here just to help black people, who went along with it. This desire to help the black face in a high place is very, very strong. And the fact that many people who opposed him were, in fact, quite racist, gave him cover and allowed him to get away with things he should not have been allowed to. But he was a neoliberal, just like Bill Clinton. So the Bush tax cuts for rich people were supposed to be temporary. He made them permanent. He waged wars or new wars quite a lot. The drone strikes, destroying Libya, trying to destroy Syria, the austerity, the budget cuts, all of these things. Even Obamacare was a conservative program. It's something Nixon tried to do in the 70s. It was a Heritage Foundation program. So that's what we got with Obama.
Well, what now again? What do you say to people that said that the reason why Obama had to govern as a boring centrist or as a right winger is because of the racial harassment he was subjected to, and it is true, he was subjected to racial harassment. Trump talking about where's that birth certificate, and yes. and him being heckled by Republicans, and of course the Koch funded rise of the Tea Party. So what do you say to people who say that Obama had to govern as a boring centrist, not give you single payer, it had to be the Heritage funded, the Heritage. What do you say to the Obama apologists?
Well, then what do you get? You just get the same kind of presidency, but only with the black person. So you're happy to see him and Michelle at a state dinner, and you're proud of them, but you didn't get anything out of it. You're no better off. But I think it also speaks to the fact that people now expect so little of their political system. And all they can hope for is to keep the worst people out of office, although following that strategy ended up putting Trump in office, ironically.
How did the Black Misleadership class, particularly in the entertainment industry, helped whitewash Obama's bloody imperial crimes and his and
well, it was just swept under the rug, and things that if nobody in the country would defend Muammar Gaddafi, black people would. But now it was Obama, so anything he did was fine. And this horrible war crime committed against that nation was overlooked, and it's quite sad. But that is an example of the impact that he had.
And we see what the Corbyn treatment Tulsi Gabbard got, because her speaking out against the Syria war and wanting to pass this Stop Funding Terrorism bill, which would have ended both the Syrian and Yemen war, two birds with one stone. The fact that I think she got such vicious hostility about that from both the Obama apologists and so forth. Does that show you how powerful Obama's propaganda machine was, and the apologeticism that he got?
Well, it wasn't just his apologists. It's the way the duopoly works in this country. And the war party is bipartisan, and if they don't crush anybody, they crush people who try to stop what they've promoted and unfortunately succeeded at for so many years. So that anybody will get that treatment who dares to question the right of the United States to commit crimes around the world.
Cynthia McKinney, when she was interviewed in John Pilger's documentary "The War You Don't See," when Pilger, who was an early critic of Obama, Cynthia McKinney said that maybe us black people, we've lost our innocence because now war is being waged with a black face. What do you say to that?
Well, that's absolutely true. If you once you decide that having the blackface in the high place is the most important thing, you can go along with anything. And we used to have a kind of protection when the Iranians took hostages in the U.S. embassy in Tehran. They let the black people go. They said black people have been oppressed. We're not going to blame them for America's crimes. That wouldn't happen now, after Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and then Barack Obama. So yes, that is true. We've lost our exception, the exception that we used to have.
Now, talk to us about the Black Alliance for Peace, actually, though, which might be, which I think is, a sign for hope after the demoralization people have felt after Obama. Yeah, talk to us about the Black Alliance for Peace.
Well, I'm on the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace. We celebrated our 4th anniversary on April 4th, chosen as that's the date of King's assassination, also the date that he officially declared himself in opposition to the war in Vietnam. And what we're trying to do is we are organizers, and as the name Black Alliance for Peace obviously tells you, we are in opposition to U.S. imperialism, invasions, occupations, sanctions, all of it. We want the military budget cut. We want to close these military bases all over the world. And domestically, we are in opposition to the militarization of American police forces, the use of surplus military equipment, the killing with impunity, the police state, all of it. So I urge your viewers to go to the blackallianceforpeace.com website and see our statements. And we have now a candidate pledge. We are asking people running for office to sign a statement saying they're going to oppose those things that I just mentioned. We want the U.S. out of Africa. The U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, has U.S. military facilities all over Africa, which does not work in the interests of African people.
And the Black Alliance for Peace, which is continuing that legacy of Paul Robeson, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, which is, injustice over, injustice here is, we also need to speak out against injustice over there. And can you talk about the Black Alliance's, the Black Alliance for Peace's, I think, very brave stance on Syria, and why so many other supposedly anti-war groups or why they've jumped the shark on Syria?
Well, we're opposed to U.S. imperialism, and the war on Syria is a classic example of that. The United States and its allies in NATO worked with the Persian Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia, worked with the jihadists, who were usually told something terrible about, ISIS and the Al-Nusra Front, which is a branch of Al-Qaeda, to try to overthrow the government of President Assad in Syria. And we take a non-interventionist stance, and people have allowed themselves to be confused by Assad. Is he good? Is he bad? Should he be president? Should he not? Whatever one thinks of him, the United States and all these other forces don't have the right to destroy Syria. Syrian people have a right to live in peace. They have a right to live free from violence. And it is for Syrian people to figure out what kind of government they want. But the United States has killed 500,000, the actions of the United States have killed 500,000 people in that country. And plus it's under sanctions and lives with great privation because of it. But I believe people on the left must always oppose interventions. And if you stick to that policy, you can't go wrong. And you don't make Gaddafi an issue. You don't make Assad an issue. You make the aggressor. The U.S. is the aggressor, and that is the issue.
But why do some of these anti-war groups and these socialist groups, why are they why how is it they can mobilize huge protests against an incoming war in Iran, which is a war for oil? And I'm no fan of the theocracy that exists in Iran, but I know for a fact any war on Iran or any color revolution in Iran, is imperialism. So how come people are mobilizing against a war for oil in Iran, but not for Syria? Why is it that the Yemenis are worthy victims, but the Syrians are unworthy victims, even though Syria, like Yemen, is under attack by the Gulf monarchs and Western-backed allies?
I think the propaganda against Syria succeeded very well. Most people want to think they're good. They want to think they're on the right side. And all you have to do is paint someone as a tyrant. And people are hesitant to oppose taking action against that person. But there are a couple of things you have to remember. Very often, the claims of tyranny are a lie. That's first of all, you can't believe 90%. And it's been proved. We know now, whistleblowers have come forward. There have been no Assad has not carried out any chemical weapons attacks in Syria, but the press just does not cover it. They just disappear this fact. And we know that America's allies killed people and posed their bodies to make it look like Assad had done it and make the case for a war. And that is what happens when you don't question, when you don't oppose the aggression of the U.S. and its allies. And you don't have to defend the other person. You don't have, and I don't know why people get stuck on this. Is so-and-so a good guy? You think Assad is a good guy? Mm-hmm. No, presidents are not good guys. And I don't have to be a supporter of Assad or a critic of Assad. My job as a citizen of this country is to oppose U.S. aggression. And that is what the left must always do.
And the Black Alliance for Peace is also for détente with Russia and is and wants an end and wants an immediate end ceasefire to the situation in Ukraine, right?
Oh, absolutely. Ukraine, the president of Ukraine was elected, President Yanukovych. He was overthrown by U.S. backed forces for many years, NGOs. The U.S. had poured money into Ukraine to try to pull Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and into the NATO orbit. And the end result has been a disaster, a failed state with an ongoing civil war. It's a terrible crime, and that has America's fingerprints all over it. So obviously, it's the kind Black Alliance for Peace didn't exist yet in 2014 when this happened, but obviously, it's the sort of thing we would oppose.
And you said a key thing: NGOs. Do you think the fact that because the previous government of Ukraine, okay, maybe maybe they were a very oligarchic government, okay, I guess I can concede that. But do you think the fact that because living in Belgium, the EU has such a good PR machine. Like many students go to work in the European Union and NATO, and even if the EU does do some good things, there's a lot of things that the EU does which is really ghastly. And because if you watch Euro News or French media, they really managed to convince everyone that what happened in Ukraine, ousting him, it was all just a very peaceful people power revolution because Ukraine just wanted to join the EU to be more progressive, and that of course Putin is the aggressor and all of that.
Well, Putin didn't want this. Putin said everybody should help Ukraine. Russia would help Ukraine, and the EU should help Ukraine, help their financial difficulties. So that is an out-and-out lie. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, the effort has been to encroach further and further into Russia to make countries members of NATO, members of the EU. The two go hand in hand. But what they did was overthrow an elected president and undo the will of the Ukrainian people. They took sides. Ukraine has this longer story, a history of a divided country, geographically divided, politically divided, and they took sides in an issue that Ukrainians should have been left to figure out for themselves, and literally caused people to die in this civil war. It's now a poorer country, much worse off. The people in power now, the country is controlled by far-right forces, some of whom are out-and-out Nazis, and that is the result of U.S. and NATO handiwork in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's true that the previous government was, was sleazy or was oligarchic.
Well, let me just talk about what the kind of government they have now. Ukraine is totally ruled by oligarchs.
Exactly.
They are more in control now than they were before. It is
the only
difference
is that they're Western-backed.
Exactly. So they are oligarchs. So who cares? But I just wanted to be mindful of the time.
Okay. Well, okay. Yeah. Last question. You did warn me about this, so shame on me. Last question I wanted to ask was now I know the Black Alliance for Peace is trying to work with other groups which are consistently and sincerely anti-imperialist.
Yes.
For social justice, reforms at home, but for anti-imperialist abroad. And I was just curious, is the Black Alliance for Peace hooking up with any indigenous organizations which have the same, which subscribe to the same views as Black Alliance for Peace, of course, very anti-racism in the U.S., but very anti-colonialism abroad?
I mean, no official relationship, but obviously as people who fight against this legacy of the settler colonial state, absolutely, we are in solidarity with the struggles of indigenous people. And abroad, the indigenous people of Bolivia, indigenous people of Venezuela are suffering because of U.S.
Brazil as well. Brazil as
well. So we are in solidarity with their struggle to be free, to practice self-determination in their countries and to be free of U.S. interference.
Well, I only hope, because I know that you mentioned that even Black Lives Matter, which happened under Obama's watch, failed many times to adequately call him out, but also call out imperialism abroad, whether it was in Congo, Rwanda, and so forth, right?
Oh, sure. They were totally a creature of the Democratic Party, and that is why you don't hear much about Black Lives Matter anymore.
I've noticed.
It had was a result of this this mass action against police brutality, but they made common cause with. They became part of the Black Misleadership class, in short.
But it seems justice will only be achieved, though, for for Black people or any people of color who are subjected to this caste system, if there's a constitutional amendment and you get rid of that loophole that's in the 13th Amendment, right? As well as ending the drug war completely.
Oh, absolutely. But both of those things have to be revolutionary. And that's a scary word, but we need fundamental change in this, very fundamental change in this country, which does not meet the needs of people in the most basic of ways. That's a longer conversation and requires changes that happen outside of the electoral system, but it's all possible. It's been done before. We have to be optimists. The revolutionary has to be an optimist. I can't remember who said that. Did Chase say that? I don't know. But that's what we have to be.
But you're optimistic about the future, even though once again it's your choices. It's two rival oligarchs. It's Pumpkinhead or Sleepy Joe, sleazy Joe, war profiteering Joe.
Well, we can't allow ourselves to be sucked into this. Every 4 years, the people who are on the left are browbeaten and told you have to support this horrible person. It'll be your fault if Republican wins. It's the fault of the Democratic Party. They're the ones.
Professor Chomsky used the World War II cards and discouraged people. It was
disgraceful. And you don't have to listen to everything Chomsky says. There's nobody you can't critique. But we have a Democratic Party which foisted this horrible man on us, who is a certain loser. And I think our response has to be, well, what are they doing? These people who assured us he was more electable, who assured us that Hillary Clinton was more electable. When do they take responsibility? When do they explain themselves? Why is it up to the left, who are always marginalized and smeared and excluded? Why is it up to us to get these people elected when the Democrats pick them, raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and then can't get them elected? So we have to turn it around. We can't allow these people to beat up on us because they fail over and over again.
But then, final question. But then, where's the hope coming from? Because I'll be honest with you. I don't feel any hope. I'm not gonna say. I was a reporter for Black Agenda Reports at the Labor Party conference, and I could see from a mile away, I think Corbyn is going to be massacred at the election because he's throwing his people power movements under the bus, and I underestimated the power of the propaganda machine. And then look at Bernie and look at Tulsi. Like I was a Tulsita, not a Sandinista, and look how Tulsi in this.
But people, you can be optimistic. Sometimes you can be optimistic after errors. And now we know we cannot depend on these Democrats. My colleague, the late Bruce Dixon, wrote in 2015 that Bernie
God
Sanders
bless his
was
soul,
just
by the way. God bless his
was
soul.
just a sheepdog for the Democrats. And if you read what he wrote in 2015 and you just change a couple of names, he hit the nail on the head. So we know what not to do. You can be optimistic there. We know we have to get out of this duopoly. And we know that we have to be ready to act. What did I think Lenin said? There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. So we could be in one of those weeks.
One can only hope.
Yes. So thank you so much.
But that's where people need to subscribe and donate generously to Black Agenda Reports, and subscribe to your SoundCloud rights on which is Margaret Kimberley on SoundCloud, right?
Yes. So if you go to the Black Agenda Report site and if you click on the interviews, you will see it's under my name again. But absolutely, we have interviews every week. And we have great book reviews, and people should buy my book. You can order Prejudential. I'll hold it up to my head. You can order it.
It's certainly on top of my list of things to get, along with Eve Engler's new books.
Yes, steerforthpress.com. You can order the book. If you don't have issues with Amazon, you can get it from Amazon. Once the bookstores reopen, once the shutdown is over, you can order it from bookstores. So thank you so much for inviting me.
And for Black Alliance for Peace, where do people go if they want to join Black Alliance for Peace, donate to Black Alliance for Peace, and future events and future events when the coronavirus is hopefully under control?
Yes, and thank God I can't wait till that happens. BlackAllianceForPeace.com. On Twitter, Blacks4Peace.
Mrs. Kimberley, thank you so much for coming on this show. I've been I love Black Agenda Reports. I feel I feel I'm at my most black when it comes to my politics.
And thank you so much.
And Black Agenda Reports, I can listen and read you, Glenn Ford, and your team all day and all night, and to have really a sincere, consistent Black left at home and anti-imperialist abroad. It really inspired me to not give up on my on my dreams of becoming a journalist, because I'm a twice college dropout.
You don't need to go to college. You just need to be a journalist, and we have the technology, so you have the ability to do it. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope this will be the first of many conversations, and wish you a good evening, and power to the people, as Glenn Ford would say.
Power to the people. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.